What if I told you that one of the most powerful civilizations in all of human history quietly erased its own name from the world map? Not because it was defeated, not because it was conquered, but by choice. A civilization that gave birth to the world's first superpower, inspired the architecture of modern governance, and produced poets whose words still echo in university lecture halls today, decided one morning in the 20th century to send a simple letter to every embassy on the planet and say, "Stop calling us that." But here is the part that will keep you watching. That decision did not come from a place of weakness. It came from a wound so deep, so old, that it had been festering for more than 2,000 years, buried under layers of conquest, religion, empire, and foreign imagination. And when you understand what was really behind that name change, you will never look at a map the same way again. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We are telling the stories that textbooks skip, civilizations, decisions, and turning points that shape the world you live in today. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments which other forgotten civilizations you want us to explore next. Now let us go back to the very beginning. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a land of extremes. Towering mountain ranges that pierce the clouds to the north and west. Scorching salt deserts at the center where nothing grows and the heat can crack stone. And yet, threading through all of it, ancient trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to Central Asia, to India, to China. Routes that carried not just silk and spices and gold, but something far more powerful: ideas, languages, gods, identities. This is the Iranian Plateau, a geographic crossroads so strategically placed that it was impossible to ignore, impossible to conquer permanently, and impossible to erase from history. For thousands of years, this land was the stage upon which some of the most dramatic acts of human civilization were performed. And to understand why Persia became Iran, you have to understand who arrived here first and what they built. Around the second millennium before the Common Era, a group of nomadic peoples began moving into this plateau from the steppes of Central Asia. They spoke languages belonging to the Indo-European family, distant linguistic relatives of the people who would later speak Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and eventually Spanish, French, Portuguese, and English. These were the Indo-Iranian peoples, and their arrival was not a single event. It was a slow migration, a gradual settling, a centuries-long process of becoming. Among them, two groups would rise to define this land. The first were the Medes, who settled in the northwestern highlands and quickly organized themselves into a formidable political structure. They were the dominant force in the region for generations, the ones other peoples looked to for leadership, for war, and for law. The second group, the Persians, settled farther south in a fertile province called Pars. They were quieter at first, less prominent, seemingly content to exist in the shadow of their more powerful neighbors. No one watching at the time would have predicted what was coming. The Persian language those early settlers spoke had nothing in common with Arabic, a fact worth emphasizing, because the world has often confused the two. In Old Persian, the word for mother was mater, and the word for father was padar. Listen to those words carefully. You can hear the echoes of Latin in them. Mater, pater. You can hear them in English too. Maternal, paternal. These were not the words of a people who came from Arabia. They were the words of an ancient, distinct, deeply rooted culture that traced its origins back to the same linguistic family as half of Europe. And out of that culture, out of that quiet southern province of Pars, a man would emerge who would change the shape of the ancient world forever. His name in Persian was Quraysh. The world would come to call him Cyrus, and they would add the word great to his name. And for once in history, that word would be fully deserved. What Cyrus accomplished beginning around 550 before the Common Era was not simply military conquest. Plenty of men had conquered territory before him. What made Cyrus different was the philosophy behind his empire. While the Assyrians had ruled through systematic terror, burning cities, deporting populations, destroying temples to break the will of the conquered, Cyrus introduced something radical. He proposed that you could rule vast territories not through fear, but through respect. After defeating the Median king Astyages and unifying the Persian tribes, Cyrus turned his attention outward with breathtaking speed. He conquered the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in what is now Western Turkey. He took Babylon, one of the most famous cities in the ancient world, without a significant battle. And when he entered Babylon, he did something that left ancient observers stunned. He did not destroy the temples. He did not enslave the population. He did not impose Persian gods. Instead, he declared that all peoples under his rule were free to worship their own deities in their own way. For the Jewish people who had been exiled to Babylon by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus was not a conqueror. He was a liberator. He gave them permission to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. The Hebrew scriptures describe him in terms reserved for figures chosen by God himself. For the Babylonians, he presented himself as the rightful king endorsed by their own god, Marduk. This was a masterclass in political legitimacy. By presenting himself not as a foreign oppressor, but as the chosen ruler of each people's own tradition, Cyrus and his successors created something the ancient world had never seen at that scale: a multicultural, multi-ethnic empire bound together not by fear, but by a shared framework of administration, law, and tolerance. Under Cyrus and his successors, especially the great administrator Darius I, the Achaemenid Empire, named for the dynasty's legendary ancestor Achaemenes, stretched from the banks of the Indus River in the east to the shores of the Aegean Sea in the west, from the cataracts of the Nile in Egypt to the steppes of Central Asia. In less than a century, the Persians had absorbed the great civilizations of the ancient world and turned them into provinces of a single coherent state. The infrastructure of this empire was staggering. A royal road network stretched over 1,500 miles, with a postal system so efficient that messages could travel from one end of the empire to the other in days. Regional governorships allowed local cultures to maintain their customs while remaining politically accountable to the Persian crown. The historian Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones has called the Achaemenid Empire without hesitation the world's first superpower. 60 to 80 distinct ethnic groups, dozens of languages, territories spanning 3 continents. But no matter how wise the philosophy, no matter how sophisticated the administration, an empire of that size carries within it the seeds of its own vulnerability. And in the year 334 before the Common Era, those seeds were watered by the hooves of a Macedonian cavalry charging east across the Hellespont. Alexander was 21 years old when he crossed into Persian territory. His stated purpose was revenge, to punish Persia for its invasions of Greece a century and a half earlier. But anyone who watched him closely understood that revenge was just a mask he wore over a deeper ambition. Alexander did not simply want to defeat Persia. He wanted to become it. At the Battle of Granicus, at the Battle of Issus, and finally at the decisive Battle of Gaugamela, the Persian army, despite fielding forces that dwarfed Alexander's in number, was broken. The Persian king Darius III fled each engagement, and his flight destroyed the psychological foundations of Persian resistance. A king who runs is a king who has already lost. But then came the moment that surprised everyone, including Alexander's own generals. When he entered Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire, a city of overwhelming beauty, its columns rising 40 feet into the air, its staircases carved with images of dozens of nations bringing tribute, Alexander did not simply destroy it. He burned the palace. Yes, in what scholars still debate was either a calculated political message or a drunken mistake. But he also began doing something deeply unexpected. He started adopting Persian customs. He began wearing Persian robes. He incorporated Persian nobles into his court and into his administration. He encouraged his officers to marry Persian women and set the example himself by marrying the Bactrian princess Roxana. For Alexander, this was not confused identity. It was deliberate strategy. He had understood something that pure military force alone could never achieve. That to rule an empire of this complexity, you had to legitimize yourself in its own terms. He was not just a Macedonian king sitting on a stolen throne. He was positioning himself as the rightful successor to the Achaemenid legacy. His Macedonian veterans did not see it that way. To them, it felt like betrayal. Conspiracies formed. Tensions exploded. Friends who had fought beside him for a decade began to look at him like a stranger. And then, in 323 before the Common Era, in Babylon, which Alexander had chosen as the capital of his new universal empire, he died. He was 32 years old. The cause remains debated to this day. Fever, poison, excessive drinking, a combination of all three. His empire, with no legitimate heir prepared, shattered almost immediately. What followed was decades of warfare among his generals. His empire shattered. But Persian culture, its language, its art, its Zoroastrian religious tradition, persisted beneath the Hellenistic overlay like embers beneath ash. It did not die. It waited. And then came the Sassanids. This is the dynasty that truly mattered for what came next, because the Sassanids did not just rule Persia. They consciously decided to resurrect it. The Sassanid dynasty emerged from the same province of Pars where it had all begun, the province that had given Persia its name in the first place. Their founder, Ardashir I, overthrew the last Parthian king in 224 of the Common Era and immediately began projecting himself not as something new, but as something restored. He claimed descent from the Achaemenid kings. He positioned his empire as the legitimate continuation of the glorious Persian past that had been interrupted by Alexander's conquest. Under the Sassanids, Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion centered on the cosmic struggle between the forces of light and darkness, and on the supreme deity Ahura Mazda, was elevated to the status of state religion with an intensity that had not existed even under the Achaemenids. Fire temples were built across the empire. A priestly class, the Magi, gained extraordinary political influence. The sacred fire that burned at the heart of Zoroastrian worship became a symbol of the empire itself. And culturally, the Sassanid period was a flowering. Philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and poetry all flourished under Sassanid patronage. The name Iran, derived from the ancient term Aryanam, meaning the land of the Aryans or the noble ones, was used officially by the Sassanid state to describe their territory. This was not a new invention. The name had ancient roots, but the Sassanids gave it formal political currency. Yet history, as always, was not finished with this land. In the 7th century of the Common Era, a force emerged from the Arabian Peninsula that would transform not just the political map, but the spiritual identity of half the world. Islam, the faith proclaimed by the Prophet Muhammad, spread with a speed that astonished its own adherents and terrified its opponents. Within decades of the Prophet's death in 632, Arab armies had swept across the Fertile Crescent, into Egypt, across North Africa, and eastward toward Persia. The Sassanid Empire, which had been exhausted by decades of brutal warfare with the Byzantine Empire, could not withstand the onslaught. The decisive Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 636 broke the back of the Sassanid military. The capital Ctesiphon fell. The last Sassanid king, Yazdijerd III, fled eastward through his own empire, finding less and less support as the Arab advance continued, until he was murdered by a local miller near the city of Merv, a miserable end for the last heir of Cyrus's legacy. But here is what makes the Persian story so extraordinary. The Arab conquest changed everything and nothing at the same time. The people of the Iranian plateau converted to Islam gradually, over generations, under varying degrees of coercion and genuine spiritual conviction. Arabic became the language of religion, of scholarship, of law, of administration. Persian absorbed thousands of Arabic words. The Zoroastrian temples were largely converted to mosques or fell into disrepair. An entire cosmological framework, the great struggle between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, the sacred fires, the ancient hymns called the Gathas, was pushed to the margins of society. And yet, the Persian language survived. Not unchanged, it had been transformed, enriched, loaded with Arabic vocabulary, and written now in Arabic script. But it survived. Persian poetry continued to be written. reaching heights of beauty that rank among the greatest achievements in world literature. The poems of Ferdowsi reconstructed the entire legendary history of pre-Islamic Iran in the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, as if to say, we were here before, and we are still here now. Persian art, Persian architecture, Persian bureaucratic traditions, all continued, often wearing new Islamic clothing, but unmistakably rooted in older soil. It was Persian administrators and Persian scholars who largely built the intellectual infrastructure of early Islamic civilization. The dynasties that ruled the Iranian plateau in the centuries following the Arab conquest were a complex patchwork, nominally Muslim, often Turkish or Mongol or mixed in their ethnic origins, but drawing on Persian administrative, cultural, and linguistic traditions for their legitimacy. Then came the Mongols. Genghis Khan's armies swept into the Iranian plateau in the early 13th century with a ferocity that left entire cities in rubble. Nishapur, Merv, Herat, Balkh, all annihilated. And yet, even the Mongols eventually succumbed to the gravitational pull of Persian culture. The Il Khanid dynasty that ruled Iran after the conquest converted to Islam and became patrons of Persian art and literature. Persian identity had survived Romans, Greeks, Arabs, Turks, and Mongols. It had survived the extinction of its ancient religion, the displacement of its original script, the replacement of its ruling dynasties. Something deep and persistent in the culture of this land refused to be erased. And then came the dynasty that would finally define what Iran would look like entering the modern world. The Safavid dynasty rose to power in the early 16th century, and their impact on Iranian identity cannot be overstated. They emerged from a Sufi religious order that had been building political influence for generations in northwestern Iran. And when their young leader Ismail, the first swept to power in 1501 at the age of 14, he made a decision that would shape Iranian civilization for the next 5 centuries. He declared Twelver Shia Islam the official state religion of Iran. This was not a minor theological adjustment. At the time, the vast majority of Muslims in the Iranian plateau, like most Muslims everywhere, followed Sunni Islam. The Safavids forced a conversion, sometimes violently, sometimes gradually, that transformed the religious identity of an entire society. Sunni scholars were expelled, exiled, or killed. Shia theologians were imported from Arab regions like Lebanon and Bahrain to establish the new religious infrastructure. New rituals, new commemorations, new theological emphases were woven into the fabric of daily life. By adopting Shia Islam, Iran distinguished itself sharply from the great Sunni empires surrounding it, the Ottoman Empire to the west, the Mughal Empire to the east. Shia Islam became not just a religion, but a marker of Iranian distinctiveness, a way of being Muslim that was simultaneously a way of being Iranian. The Safavid period was also a cultural renaissance of extraordinary energy. The city of Isfahan, transformed by Shah Abbas the Great, became one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Its central square surrounded by a royal mosque, a merchant's bazaar, and a palace, leaving European travelers breathless. Persian miniature painting, carpet weaving, and tile work all reached new peaks under Safavid patronage. And it was during this period that the name Iran began to reassert itself in political and cultural discourse. The Safavids thought of their realm as Iran. The Persian language poetry, history, and philosophy produced under their patronage used Iran as the term for this land and its people. The ancient connection between the name and the people's deepest sense of themselves was being deliberately reinforced. But here is the paradox. Outside Iran, in Europe and across the wider world, the name Persia had taken hold centuries earlier and refused to let go. The Greeks had learned the country from the province of Pars. They called it Persis, which became Persia in Latin, and then in every European language descended from or influenced by Latin. That name, Persia, had been carried forward through every century of European scholarship, diplomacy, and trade. Maps printed in Amsterdam and London in the 17th century said Persia. Treaties signed in Paris said Persia. The products exported from the country, those extraordinary carpets, those fine textiles, those elaborate metalworks, were called Persian in every market from London to Lima. Persia was, in effect, a European projection. It was a name outsiders had used since the ancient Greeks, rooted in the provincial name Pars, carried forward through every century of European scholarship, diplomacy, and trade. The people living there called their country Iran, had called it Iran, in one form or another since the Sassanid period. But the outside world did not know this or did not care. This tension, Iran internally, Persia externally, persisted until the 20th century brought it to a head. The man who forced the resolution was Reza Shah Pahlavi, a military strongman who became Shah of Iran in 1926, determined to transform his country into a modern, secular, industrialized nation-state. He built railroads, established universities, suppressed the political power of the clergy, and promoted the pre-Islamic history of Iran with an almost evangelical zeal. And in 1935, he sent a diplomatic circular to all foreign embassies and governments with a simple, clear request. Please refer to our country henceforth by its own name, not Persia, Iran. The request was not arbitrary. The word Iran, derived from the ancient Aryanam, was connected to Pan-Aryan theories circulating in European and Iranian intellectual circles at the time. Some have suggested Reza Shah was influenced by the ideological climate that celebrated Aryan identity, using the name Iran to affiliate his country with that framework on the world stage. Whether or not that is accurate, the practical effect was clear. By insisting on Iran rather than Persia, he was trying to break the Orientalist frame through which the West had long viewed his country. Images of decadence, exotic luxury, a civilization incapable of modern dynamism. By demanding the name Iran, he was saying, "We are not your exotic fairy tale. We are a modern nation with our own name, our own identity, our own future." Within Iran itself, the response was not entirely enthusiastic. For many intellectuals, poets, and ordinary citizens, the name Persia and all it represented was a source of enormous pride. It was the name associated with Cyrus the Great, with Darius's administrative genius, with the poetry of Hafez and Rumi and Ferdowsi, with the architecture of Persepolis and the carpets of Isfahan. Abandoning it felt to some like cutting a cord that connected them to thousands of years of glory. The debate did not end in 1935. It simply changed form. 44 years later, in 1979, a revolution shook Iran to its foundations and shook the entire world along with it. The movement led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini overthrew the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the son of the man who had insisted on the name Iran, and established the Islamic Republic of Iran, a theocratic government grounded in Shia Islamic law and deeply hostile to the Western powers that had supported the Shah's regime. The revolution transformed Iran's image in the Western imagination almost overnight. Before 1979, Iran, still called Persia by older generations and in cultural contexts, had been seen in the West largely as an ally, a modernizing country, part of the Cold War bloc against Soviet communism. After 1979, Iran became synonymous in Western media with hostage crises, fanaticism, sanctions, and geopolitical confrontation. And here is where the story becomes philosophically fascinating. In the years following the revolution, the name Persia began a strange cultural rehabilitation in the West. Iranian emigres living abroad often prefer to call themselves Persian rather than Iranian. Not because they rejected the name of their homeland, but because they wanted to signal their cultural heritage rather than their association with a political regime they had fled. Two names, one land, and a continuous, unresolved argument about which of them tells the truth. The story of how Persia became Iran is, at its deepest level, a story about the power of names, about who gets to name a people, and what that naming reveals about the relationship between power and identity. The Greeks named a province, and the name stuck to an entire civilization for 2,000 years. An empire so vast and so sophisticated that it invented the concept of universal rule could not control what strangers chose to call it. And when it finally asserted its own name in the 20th century, the assertion itself became a political act loaded with ideology ambition, and the weight of all those centuries. There is something in this story that reaches beyond the boundaries of Iran. Every nation that has been named by its colonizers, every people that has been defined by outside observers, every civilization that has been filtered through a foreign imagination, they all carry something of this struggle. The name you are given and the name you claim for yourself are never quite the same thing. And the distance between them is the distance between being seen and being known. Iran was always there. The people who lived on that plateau, who built those empires, who wrote those poems, who maintained that identity through invasion after invasion after invasion. They always called their land by some version of that name. What changed in 1935 was not the land, not the people, not even the name itself. What changed was the demand to be acknowledged on their own terms. That demand is still being made, and its full answer has not yet been given. What you have just heard is not simply a history lesson. It is a reminder that identity is never given. It is always fought for. The story of Persia and Iran is the story of civilization that refused to disappear, refused to be defined by others, and refused to allow its deepest sense of self to be erased by conquest, religion, or time. In every name that people choose for themselves, there is a declaration of survival. And in every attempt to erase that name, there is a fear of what that survival represents. If you have made it this far, you already know that this kind of storytelling is different. Not just dates and battles, but the hidden forces underneath history, the decisions that shaped entire civilizations, the stories that never make it into textbooks. If that is the kind of content you want more of, then subscribing right now is the most important thing you can do. Hit the like button so this story reaches more people who deserve to hear it. Every like, every subscription, every comment, it is what keeps these stories alive. And there are so many more waiting for you. The next one might be even more extraordinary than this one. We will see you there.